Welcome back to another episode of the Evolving Hunter podcast. My name is Jay. I am thrilled that you've chosen to join us for another episode. I think it's going to be a really good one. Today we're talking about how conservation is funded in the U.S., and we have a excellent guest today with us to speak about that. James Burnham, who's a biologist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he works specifically in the Office of Conservation and Investment. Thanks for taking the time to join me today, James. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. It's great to be on the show, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Me too. So we're going to jump into more introductions in just a moment. But first, I want to jump into some questions. So if you've been listening to the show for a while, you may have heard me trying to plug my email address at the end of every episode, trying to get folks to send in some questions that we can answer live on the show. And I'm happy to say that we've actually gotten some questions. You know, we're a new podcast. It's nice to get some traction and to hear from some folks. You know, when I hit publish on a podcast, a lot of times it goes into the abyss. So it's a ton of fun for me to hear back from listeners who are listening to the show. So hopefully this is a regular segment on the podcast to answer questions for listeners, novice hunters, wherever you're at in your hunting journey. We will do our best to at least provide our thoughts on what the answers may be. So enough about that. I'll jump right into it. So I received an email from a gentleman named Tyler, and I'm just gonna read it to you. It's got his question on the end, but it does kind of set him up there. It says, "Hey Jay, this is Tyler. I didn't grow up hunting at all. My family wasn't necessarily against it. It was just something that we ever did. I got interested in over the last couple of years, just being outside more. I started hiking, got into camping, and somewhere along the way, I started thinking I would like to be more connected to where my food comes from." That's an awesome thought, Tyler. So this year, I decided I'm actually going to try it. I did take my hunter safety course, and I purchased a used rifle from a local gun shop, and I've been going to the range when I can. Now that the season is getting closer, guessing he's talking about spring turkey. Not sure, but I'm realizing that I really don't have any idea of what my first season should even look like. Part of me feels like if I don't get an animal, I will feel like a failure. But the other part of me knows that I'm brand new and probably just have a lot to learn being out there. So I guess my question is, here we go. What should I actually focus on my first season? Should I really be pushing to fill up my tag, or just be happy with learning as much as I can? That's a cool question, Tyler. I'm glad you're thinking about it in that way. What do you think, James? What's your? I know I introduced this question about a second ago to you. Where'd your thoughts be, Tyler?
Well, so my thoughts with Tyler is I want to kind of unpack where he's coming from that, right? Like if there's an upcoming season and he's got a rifle, like spring turkey and rifles don't usually mix. So,
yeah.
You know, there's some questions with that, but more importantly, you know, that perspective of where should he be focusing? What should he be looking at? It echoes a lot with some of my early turkey hunting experiences. I remember trying to work up the motivation, and I was having a hard time because it was new to turkey hunting. I was new to the area. I didn't have a spot. I was just kind of going in blind, and I was complaining about it to my wife, we weren't married at the time, but I was like, yeah, I don't know if it's going to be worth it if I like get up dog early and drag my butt out there and sit down and I don't get anything. And she kind of looked at me and she goes, well, if that's all you're out there for, is that the right reason to be out there? And it was just a sucker punch of a question. Yeah. She hit me right between the eyes with it. And, you know, she was absolutely right. And especially with spring turkey hunting, it's just, there's so much going on. You know, if I get a bird, it's just the icing on the cake. You know, I go out there because the woods are waking up after a long winter. It's just, there's a lot of action happening. Even if I don't see turkeys, there's stuff that I do see. You know, I also, spring foraging is big in my world. So I go after ramps, I go after fiddleheads, I go after morels.
That's awesome.
So So, there's something happening. So I totally understand the desire and drive to fill a tag. I mean, I'm out there to fill a tag. I don't like coming home with tag soup. Nobody really does. But for me personally, on my end, I'm out there to be out there, and hunting is just sort of the excuse to be out there. It's kind of that thing where if I don't set aside hunting time, well, then other stuff fills that space. But if I sit there and I go, I'm going hunting, okay, then I get to go and wander in the woods and see what I can see. And that's the real, that's the real thing, right? Like filling a tag is great. We all love doing it. I love eating birds. I love eating deer. I love eating what I get, but I get a lot more than just filling a tag when I'm going out.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I mean, there's harvesting an animal is a part of hunting. It's not all of hunting, right?
Right.
There's so much,
Yep.
and I've talked about this in the podcast a lot before. Like, if success is harvesting an animal as a part of your hunt, and I think we as naturally as humans want to feel success, then I would have stopped hunting like in the first year or two.
Yeah.
There was nothing that persisted, but finding the things that bring you back to it, and recognizing that time in the woods really is, and you mentioned this, Tyler, that should be focused on learning. Everyone in hunting is still focused on learning, right? Like, there's no like, I figured out hunting, I solved hunting.
Right.
So
Right.
that's a mindset to always have, even when you're more consistently filling tags, because your learning has progressed to know how to scout better, how to identify, where are those turkeys going to come out of that roost, when the sun comes up, those things. But yeah, absolutely. Just have fun
Yeah.
with it. Like, there's no pressure. I mean, there can be pressure, right? I mean, some people choose to put pressure on themselves, and that actually is a part of their experience, and they enjoy that. I can't speak for you, Tyler. I'm not that kind of person at all. Like,
Yeah.
this is a day off of work, and I'm going to have some fun. And whether that means bringing a bird home or not, it's icing on the cake, as you put it.
Yeah. Yeah. So Tyler, what should you focus on? You should focus on, you're at the tip of this, you're at the start of this journey. You should focus on figuring out what you like. There's a lot of different ways to hunt. I know folks who hate turkey hunting because they don't want to sit still. They don't like deer hunting because they don't want to sit still, but they love pheasant hunting or grouse hunting. There are folks who they just want to feel like they're in a video game and stuff's coming all around them. So doves and waterfowl kind of fit that mindset a little better. Personally, it drives me crazy. I can't. I've always got my head on a swivel in a dove field or a duck blind. I don't like not knowing where stuff's coming from. So it really comes down to finding the hunting that you connect with and just really exploring and building off of that. And that gun you got. I don't know what gun you got. I don't know if it's a 22. I don't know if it's a 30-06, but that's also going to determine what you should be chasing after. Because if you unload on a squirrel with a 308, there ain't going to be much left.
Not much squirrel left. Yeah.
No,
Tyler, if you are working toward going out and spring turkey and you bought a rifle, email me. The same email address you sent this question in. Email me what you got, and then we'll talk it through to see kind of what you got and what you're working with. I'd be more than happy to help there. So cool. But thank you, Tyler, for sending your question. Like, this confirms to me that this podcast has a place within like the universe of hunting podcasts. Because no disparagement to other hunting podcasts. I'm a heavy consumer of podcast media in the hunting world, and it's great, but but a lot of times it's focused on, these big giant hunts and going out and people, whatever the case may be. So I'm really happy to talk with novice hunters, kind of figure out where they're heading to, where they want to go. So cool. Thanks. Hey folks, Jay here. Just taking a short break from the show to let you know about something that I am really excited about. My first few times chasing turkeys, I wasn't learning. I was just repeating the same mistakes, but just in different woods. Hearing birds, getting close, and then blowing it without really knowing why. That can be a really frustrating part about turkey hunting. It's not always obvious what you're doing wrong. As you know, we are proudly partnered with CertifiedHunter.com. Their hunter education course is designed to help you learn how to safely get out into the woods as a hunter with confidence. But they've also just started developing courses to help you learn more about hunting specific species. I had the honor to help them to develop their newest course called Turkey Hunting Fundamentals. This online course is designed to help bring clarity to turkey hunting, how birds move, how to set up on them, when to push, when to sit tight. All that stuff can actually really change outcomes. So if you're new or if you're just tired of guessing, I promise you it's worth your time. If you want to check it out, go to certifiedhunter.com/courses to get started. All right, let's jump back into the show. One more question. This gentleman that wrote in is named Marcus, and he lives in Atlanta, Georgia. He said, "Hello, Jay. This is Marcus. I've been listening to the podcast for a bit, and I've been curious about hunting for a long time, but I'll be honest, I have zero background in it. I grew up in the city here in Atlanta. Nobody in my family hunts. Nah, I don't know anyone who hunts. Most of what I know has come from YouTube and podcasts like yours. I've gotten to the point where I don't just want to learn about it. I actually want to try it, but I feel stuck. Everything I hear is that having a mentor makes a huge difference. I've heard you talk about it a lot. I'm guessing he means me. Because there's just so much I don't know. The problem is I don't know where to start to find someone. I don't want to be that guy asking random people to take me hunting. And honestly, I don't know how to approach it. How do I find a mentor when you don't have any connections to hunting at all? What an awesome question. Because it's an awesome question because there's tons of other people are in the same boat, right? They're interested in hunting. They're interested in experiencing it. They want to secure, their own protein that they help, have a hand in bringing to the table, but they don't know where to start. So I'll throw it to you first, James. What do you think?
Yeah, Marcus, that's a phenomenal question. You're not alone. There's a ton of folks that are out there that are hunting curious. They want to know more about it. They know that it's out there. They just can't get there from where they're from. And I see it a lot online. I see it a lot in the forums. I see it a lot in the chats. I see it a lot in the social media. And the very first, most important thing that I would say is, and it feels weird saying this on a podcast, is quit listening to podcasts, quit watching YouTube.
Not this one.
Not this one. Listen to this, finish this one, and then turn it off. And then reach out to Georgia DNR. Yeah. Georgia DNR, I know for a fact that the Georgia Department of Natural Resources runs one of the more aggressive and comprehensive learn to hunt programming systems in collaboration with the Georgia Wildlife Federation. So those are, if you're going to Google anything, if you're going to put it into the Google box, put in Georgia DNR Learn to Hunt or Georgia Wildlife Federation Learn to Hunt, and you should be able to find fairly quickly some links that get you to a place that can get you connected to people that teach classes of other absolute beginners that don't know how to do this stuff. I know Georgia made a lot of headway with doing crossbow hunting for deer in metro Atlanta to teach people how to hunt and harvest their own animals. So these programs are out there. They're run by trained professional staff that know how to do this stuff, that know how to talk to new hunters. So one of the things that you risk with just asking random people is they may not know how to talk to new hunters. And it's a slightly different skill set and slightly different language. So getting connected to those programs that are used to dealing with adult hunters that are new to this stuff, that is the best thing you can do, because not only is it going to get you connected to the educational component that you need, it's also going to get you plugged into a social network of folks that are doing this stuff that you can draw on to learn with, but also draw on to learn from. And both of those elements are really important as you go down this path.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, absolutely. If I could have a sign that I wear a lot as my role as trying to help new hunters is build a relationship with your with your DNR, your wildlife agency, whatever it is called in your state, because um, uh, throughout what I do for a living, right, you as well, spend a lot of time with the folks that are running these agencies that are putting the boots on the ground, hard work to help hunters. And it it's just a giant group of very passionate people that
Right.
work very hard, and they're always trying to bring innovations to help new hunters, new ways to bring new hunters in, whether that be through actual mentored hunts down to more like introductory kind of activities, is to see if this is something that's for you. And so that's the best thing you can do is to reach out to your DNR, your wildlife agency, whatever it's called in your state. For you, Marcus, yeah, the Georgia DNR, and they'll be elated, so excited to help get you started, and start to build a community in hunting. I think another thing that you can choose to do, I'd honestly recommend reaching out to DNR first, because they're going to have programs that are in person that you can go to and get to know people, get to know hunting, etc. As you progress a bit, if you feel like you still need some support on more specific things, the International Hunter Education Association has a program called learnhunting.org. It's something that I was a part of making back when I was working with IHEA, where they have experienced hunters who can create accounts to say, hey, I'm interested in helping a new hunter. And then you as a new hunter can go and create your own account, and you can find those folks that are in your region searching on a map, and you can read about what they're interested in mentoring. So maybe they only want to help new turkey hunters, or maybe they want to help turkey and deer hunters, or whatever the case may be. You can see all that. You can reach out to them through the platform and start to develop a relationship. And it's not always you're having to meet up with this person, right, to go on a hunt. It could just be, if you just need a sounding board to exchange emails back and forth, or text messages with questions you may have about firearms or gear or scouting, whatever the case may be. That's a great resource too. And learnhunting.org has had a lot of success in helping novice hunters in that way. And it's completely free. It's free to everyone involved. You can just go and create your account and be a part of it. So yeah, cool.
That's also a great resource.
Absolutely. Marcus, if I can be any support to you and ask and kind of pointing you in directions, please feel free to send me an email again. I'll probably reply to you on this one. But I'm always happy to help where I can. Awesome. Which leads us, I'm going to try to make the segue here, James. Are you ready?
Yeah,
Which leads us, the amazing programs that state agencies have to support new hunters. They have to be funded from somewhere, right?
That's solid. That's a solid segue. That's a good job. Yeah.
And that funding comes from a variety of places. But most notably comes through the work that you and the giant team there, Office of Conservation Investment, do. But before we dive deep into where that came from and what it's doing today, I want to chat with you a bit about your story, about how you got into hunting, and just like a general introduction. Let us get to know you a bit before we jump into the money talk.
Yeah, sure thing. I really appreciate that. And, I think I've listened to your podcast a couple times now. I've listened to what's available. So I appreciate this question. I like how you've asked it for all your guests that I've heard of so far. I thought about this a lot. In a lot of these conversations, you have folks that have been doing it their whole lives, and it's second nature, and they've got all the stuff and all the connections, and it's just sort of the world that they inherited, right? And then we've got folks like you and Marcus and Tyler that came to it later and for their own reasons, and are learning it as an adult and kind of coming to it. And I'm a little bit of an oddball because I kind of have a foot in both of those worlds. I grew up, I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. So shout out Marcus. I was Decatur represent.
ATO?
Yeah, ATL. And so I grew up in Atlanta. I was a city kid, but my dad's family was from down in South Georgia and lots of connections around. So I got taken out when I was younger deer hunting, and it was Georgia deer hunting on private land. The access that my grandfather had. He was just an old school North Georgia hillbilly. I mean, he would this is zero exaggeration, in the suburbs of South Atlanta and Clayton County, he would take his 22 and pick squirrels off the back fence and then throw them in the stew pot. I mean, that's how he rolled. And, so that's who really gave me my first exposure to hunting. Now, the thing with that was it didn't stick. You know, we went out hunting 4 or 5 years in a row, and it was just a Keystone Cops routine every time we went out. If something could go wrong, it went wrong. I never saw anybody get a deer in 5 years hunting on private land in Georgia, which is hard to do. You know, as an adult, I can say that. And at the time, I was like, oh, this is just what it is. We never get anything. But as an adult, I'm like, wow, that, that's an accomplishment. The truck would break down. The rifle wasn't sighted in. There's trash in the bottom of the blind that spooked the deer. Like whatever could happen happened. And I never saw anything good come out of hunting as a kid. All I saw was that I had to get up early. It was cold. I didn't really like it. So I kind of left hunting. And growing up and in high school and stuff, I was really active in scouts. I was really active in the outdoors, camping, backpacking, all that stuff. That led me down a trail towards pursuing an environmental career. I went into research on animals. I spent about a 20-year window there doing hardcore research on international wildlife conservation and ecology studies on migratory water birds overseas. I was operating in China and Mongolia. And hunting was just sort of this thing that's what I did when I was a kid, but I'm doing this conservation biology, ecology stuff now. And the longer I went down that path, this is something that, I got my bachelor's, I went to go back and get my master's, I then worked for an NGO, then I went to get my PhD. The farther I went down this field and down this path, the less time I was spending outside, the more time I was spending in front of a computer. And that's not why I went into that field. And I wanted to be outside. And so to get that outside fix, I started working with local landowners on managing their property. Now, at this point, I've relocated up to the upper Midwest. I went to grad school for my master's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I stayed there for my PhD. I was working with a local nonprofit. So I'm a transplant and I've got no connection to land or people, and I'm figuring this out. So I start working with local properties, doing invasive species removal, prescribed burning, habitat management, rebuilding and recreating some of these environments for tallgrass prairie and oak savannas. And through that, I discovered this really strong desire to connect to a place. And I don't know if that's because I'm a transplant and it just wasn't there anymore, or I just enjoyed the environment. And through that, I actually came back to hunting because I went to, it took me, I worked on properties for about 5 or 6 years before I worked up the courage to say, hey, would it be okay if I deer hunted here? And I went back to deer hunting because that's all I knew, and wound up harvesting my first deer after a 20-year hiatus of hunting. I got exposed to hunting as a teenager, but I didn't get my first deer until I was in my mid 30s, and it's just been going ever since. And from there, I picked up turkey hunting through a learn to hunt class, through an adult learn to hunt class offered through the Wisconsin DNR. And it was one of those things that the first time I went out in the woods turkey hunting, I was like, this is it, man. This is what I like. I'm here. I'm in it. This is what I want more of. And it's just been going since then. So I've been able to come into this role, through those learn to hunt classes. I started mentoring other adult onset hunters. I started helping coordinate the classes as a volunteer. And then, I made a real big pivot and I left academia after I completed my PhD and went to be the recruitment, retention, reactivation coordinator for the state of Minnesota. So I moved over one state to the left and a little bit north and coordinated their statewide programs for 5 years before coming to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help with the grants that fund these activities along with a lot of other stuff. So that's kind of my story, my journey. So that's why I'm here. And these things, the activities, hunting, connecting to those outdoors, that's really where it connected to me at a fundamental level that I don't think I know I didn't appreciate it when I was younger, but it really tapped into a lot of the parallel threads that I was laying down as I was growing up.
Cool. Thanks for sharing your story there. I'm curious, a lot of times you have a conversation with someone who has been hunting for a longer time, right? It's not uncommon to see hunters come in, maybe they'll hunt for a season or two, they'll get their feet wet, and perhaps during that time of those season or two period of time, there lacks a presence of a hook, right? Of
Yeah.
something that kind of concreted in their mind and tied them to say, okay, this is, I'm going to include this as a part of like who I am, right? I'm a part of me as a hunter. So like I've been hooked in that way. So I'm curious for you, having had experience as as a younger person returning, in I think you said your mid 30s or early 30s. What for you has been the hook to where now you feel like, I'm not trying to speak for that you feel like you can be a lifelong hunter, but I'm assuming, right, that hunting is going to be something that you continue in the future. What has been that hook for you?
That's interesting. I don't think there's a single hook. I think there
Yeah.
are a few. I think there's a treble hook there. There are at least three. Uh, you know, um, One is it's that connection to a place. I
Mm,
worked on a property for years before I harvested a deer off of there, and I got to tell you, I still go back and I hunt that property, and I can compare it. At this point, I can compare it to properties that I don't manage or haven't helped out with, public land properties and other private land. And the deer never taste as good as they do when I get it off that property because I know the amount of work that's gone in to make good habitat. I know, we're talking thousands of person hours over, 20 years to create habitat that, deer, turkey, quail, grouse are all utilizing. And so when I harvest an animal off of that, there's just, and it can be a turkey or a deer or whatever, or squirrel, it means more to me because of that, because of the work that I put into that place. So that's one hook. You know, I would say another hook is, the inverse to that is, up here in Minnesota when I'm hunting specifically turkey, I'm on public land in Minnesota, and it's the hook is, and I kind of alluded to this in the first question. It's I'm getting out and I'm getting to see and explore a new place. I get to be a kid again, finding what's around the next corner, finding what's over the next hill, seeing what that layout is. And so that to me is, it gets me into to see new areas of a place that I've decided to call home, even though I'm way behind on the lived experience that people have up here. So I'm just out there finding all the nooks and crannies and seeing what's there. And then I'd say the third hook is just being able to, I spent 20 years building a pretty solid formal training in ecology and conservation biology and ornithology, and getting to apply that in ways that I never got to apply in my academic field, right? So like even when I'm not pulling in birds, and I go out with some really hardcore guys, right? Like guys that, if they don't get a bird, it's just a busted hunt and they're ticked off. But, I get to sit there and I'm geeking out over the fact that we're duck hunting in a spot that has giant puffball mushrooms that are ready for harvest. I'm seeing the woods in a slightly different way. And so that's the other hook, is just being able to apply that skill set in ways that I don't see with, there's some other hunters that have it, but, for me, I have new hunters that are like, what do you do when you're bored? And I'm like, I'm rarely bored. Like I'm listening to birds. I'm looking at plants. I'm like trying to figure out, why is that patch of columbine in that spot versus this patch of big blue stem over here? Is a soil difference? Is it water seepage? Like that, those are the mental exercises I'm doing when I'm out. And so that's probably the third big hook, is just being able to exercise those skill sets that I've spent a lot of time building.
That's interesting. We've talked about this before on the podcast, with the idea of taking your time in the woods as an opportunity to be a student, right? Because ultimately it develops a richer experience, right? Because, as you said, very rarely bored, because there's things to see, to think about, to learn, right? And also it makes you a better hunter, because you start to connect the dots a little bit more when you're in the field about habitat, about what are they eating, how are they moving, why are they moving there, right? Why are they eating those things right now? All those things really play a huge factor, right? As opposed to, because I feel like, particularly, I mean, I still feel like I'm in early years, but particularly in my early years, it was a lot of just like, all right, I'm sitting here, I don't see anything, right? And there was a boredom,
Yep.
absolutely, there was a boredom. I've talked about on the podcast before that hunting is largely a social activity for me. Like, that's just my nature. I'm a very social person. I want to go hang out with friends. And there are times like when we would split up, I'd be like, oh man, because, that's kind of why I was there, is to be social and have fun with my buddies out in the woods. But as I've been in it a little longer, I feel like I've had a similar disposition, right? Of like, where are the questions that I could think about,
Yeah.
while I'm sitting here, and the observations that I could make that could perhaps help me, right? As a developing
Yeah.
hunter, as a person who is quite concerned with the conservation of the resources that we have in the U.S., North America, bigger picture. So cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. There's just that thing where when I'm bird watching, when I'm bike riding, when I'm running pavement or trail, I'm always walking a path that a person put there for whatever reason, right? Like maybe it was ease of access, maybe that's just where they had the property rights, whatever it is. But when I'm hunting, I'm following game trails, and they
Yeah.
move across the land for very different reasons. And so it's a much more active way to engage with the outdoors for me, right? Like I can't just like go on autopilot and let my feet follow the path. Like I've got to sit there and think about, okay, here's this trail, here's that trail. Which way did they go? Why would they go there? Is there bedding? Is there food? Is there cover? Is there water? And when I try to explain it to non-hunters, I'm like, okay, have you ever ridden a motorcycle? And if they've ridden a motorcycle, it's like, okay, it's kind of like the difference between riding in a car and riding in a motorcycle. You can't just zone out when you're riding on a motorcycle. That is a good way to wind up in the hospital or dead, right?
Yeah.
So you're like, your brain is active, and you feel it. You feel it all over your body. You feel it in your face. In the car, you can kind of just zone out, listen to the radio, kind of have your mind wander, make sure cars in front of you aren't stopping abruptly or
Yeah.
whatever. But yeah, it's just that it's a completely different mindset, and it's a lot more active when I'm out there. And so, yeah, to your point, it's this really great way to think about it and engage with it.
Absolutely. You mentioned man-made things. One of my favorite things, like when you're in the middle of nowhere, like just out in the woods, is to come across something man-made. And I'm talking like trash, right? That's annoying. But like something that someone built in the middle of nowhere, something old,
Mm-hmm.
that gets me thinking for sure.
Yeah.
Like why,
Yeah.
how in the world? There's a spot, for a brief while, I lived in Maggie Valley, North Carolina, up on Phi Top Mountain. And on the opposite side, if you go like over the mountain and down the end of the valley, you end up in Cataloochee Valley, which used to be a settlement of people there a long time ago. And I knew that was the case. And, but it gets in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. So I wasn't hunting, but you could fish there. And this was like right out of undergrad. So it was like my first quote unquote real job. And I made very little money. I'm talking real low money. And so I honestly depended on fishing
Yeah.
for a while, right?
Yep.
To feed myself. And I could actually go out from where I lived and it's kind of bushwhack down in the valley, and I could get to some really great trout streams down there where you could fish. And I recall being, in my mind, like really just, I was out there. I was not close to anybody, and coming across this stone fence that went for like ever. It just continued. I walked it until I got this is silly. I should stop walking this fence. I have to walk back, it blew my mind. Like it's like a core memory that like it stuck with me to think like, man, someone built this fence for a reason here in the middle of the North Carolina mountains. Right. And it's still there hundreds of years later. Right. It's mind blowing, but
yeah. Yeah, it's you never know what you're going to find out there. You never know what you're going to see. And it changes week to week. You especially in these transition seasons like spring and fall. I mean, it's just that's part of the appeal. Is just getting out there and seeing like, hey, I might have been to the spot 100 times, but what's coming through this time? What's come up in the last week? Especially up here in the upper Midwest, like you blink, you're going to miss some flowers. You're going to miss some good opportunities to take some tasty stuff home and eat it. So you gotta be on it.
If you're listening to this podcast, there's a good chance that you're either thinking about hunting for the first time or trying to get better at it. Either way, you need to start with the right foundation. And that's why I'm so excited for the Evolving Hunter podcast to be partnering with CertifiedHunter.com. Certified Hunter offers state-approved online hunter education that's built for real people, not just test takers. You'll learn firearm safety, ethical decision-making, wildlife conservation, and what it actually means to be a responsible hunter in the field. And here's the part that matters most. This isn't about checking a box. It's about showing up prepared, confident, and safe when the season opens. I didn't grow up hunting. I started later in life, and I can tell you firsthand that having clear, practical training makes a huge difference. Certified Hunter helps shorten the learning curve and sets you up to do this the right way from day one. So, if you're ready to take your first step into hunting, or you know someone who is, head to CertifiedHunter.com/evolving hunter and get started today. Again, that's CertifiedHunter.com/evolving hunter, and let's start the right way. So, my hope with this conversation is to paint a picture. I want to paint a picture, if we can, of like the large scale view of how we ended up with the system of conservation funding that we have now. So talking a bit about the past, about how things developed to what we're doing now as it relates to conservation funding in the U.S. So a lot of it takes us back from a historical perspective to like the late 1800s, 1900s, right? With the Lacey Act and the Pittman-Robertson Act. So for those of you that you may not know, prior to these two acts coming into fruition, right? In the Lacey Act was 1900, and Pittman-Robertson was 1932? 1937. I was close.
Yeah.
So, but prior to those coming into play, the way in which we managed wildlife, performed conservation in general, was quite different, right? In that in the U.S., we had market hunting, right? Where hunting was industrial. It wasn't necessarily recreational. Wildlife was seen as food, feathers, fur, and ultimately profit. You could go and harvest animals and sell them, whether that be for their hides, for their feathers, or for their meat in general. And during that time, there really weren't like a system for seasons, bag limits, enforcement. All that really wasn't in effect. And all of that lack of rules and structure and this sort of industry built behind profit for wildlife, really led to like near ecological bankruptcy. I mean, like it had serious impact on the wildlife and the environments that we had in the U.S. And so this led first to the Lacey Act, really trying to stop the bleed, right? In some senses of just purging out, this desirable, wildlife that they were going for. to make it illegal to sell game, sell wild game and transport wild game for the purposes of selling. And so it really gave the federal government um, some teeth, right, in the respect of enforcing wildlife laws. And so the way I kind of see it in my head, the Lacey Act, as you know, as I said before, was kind of stopping the bleed, and the Pittman-Robertson Act came about really to begin to restore some of what had been damaged prior to the Lacey Act. And so the Pittman-Robertson Act came along in 1937,
Yeah.
right? Where there were two kind of primary, I don't know if they were congressmen or senators, but it was Pittman and Robertson, came about and really pushed this idea through that conservation would be really user funded, right? Those who are hunting, or, you know, taking part in hunting activities would pay into the system for supporting conservation financially. So that was my Jay Ellison, what I know about Pittman-Robertson and Lacey Act view. Is there anything you would add to that about the early days, about those coming into fruition?
Yeah, so I think that's a great launching pad, because you know the problem with history is that there's no start and stop button, right? Like it's just a
Yeah,
continuous flow. So it's always tricky to say where do these things begin. And you know, the Lacey Act is a great benchmark. It really is sort of that first, you know, national level recognition that, hey, we gotta do something here. And I think it's important to provide the context behind that. You know, you alluded to the market hunting. It's one of those things that in this day and age, it's kind of hard to even imagine why that would even exist, right? But
sure.
if
Yeah,
you think back to the 1800s, you know, you had this growing East Coast population. You had people flooding across the interior of the United States. You had bountiful game, right? You know, you're talking elk and caribou in the eastern United States, you know, millions of bison. We had passenger pigeon populations that darkened the skies in
yeah,
Ohio and in the Mississippi Valley. And so you just had this phenomenal resource that, you know, the people coming in, they saw it, to your point, they saw it as a marketable opportunity. You know, you could harvest these animals, pack them up and ship them back east to a growing urban population that didn't necessarily have as much access to cultivated farmed animals like pigs and cows and sheep and goats. So that really was sort of the mechanism that drove a lot of these populations, just either completely wiped them out like the passenger pigeon or drove them to the brink like the bison. And that Lacey Act was really that first national recognition of whoa, we gotta dial this back, right? And you know, prior to that, there were, you know, those early days, it's like a lot of things, right? There are these fits, there are these starts, there are these little case studies or experimental ideas that pop up, and you know, part of that is the first hunting regulations, as far as I can tell. I'm not a historian, so if there are any historians listening to this podcast and they call me out, please educate me, let me know. But as far as I'm aware, the first hunting regulations came around the late 1890s, like 1895, 1897. And that was just like one or two states though, right? Like they saw what was happening. They needed to set a season. And so, but that was just like these, again, fits and starts, right? You know, you had in that second half of the 1800s, you saw this growing recognition that we can't just cut everything down. We can't just shoot everything and eat it. We can't just package everything up. We have to have some systems in place to protect things. And, you know, Yellowstone gets established as the first national park in like, that was like 1872. You know, you had, so like, okay, all of a sudden we've got this recognition that we need to protect some stuff. You've got the first fish hatchery that's established also in 1872, which is currently underneath Lake Shasta in Northern California. So you had this recognition of, okay, not only do we need to protect things, but we need to help things out a little bit, right? And the fish hatchery was really rooted in that commercial sort of, hey, we're starting to deplete some things, and we need to make this sustainable. And all of this is happening in this growing recognition of, okay, we've got to do some stuff. The Lacey Act prohibits the trade in wildlife and transportation. You had your first National Wildlife Refuge established in 1903. That was Pelican Island. That would lead to the refuge system that we have today, which I'm almost positive that we have at least one National Wildlife Refuge in every state in America. They're all over the place, and those are public lands. We don't have a national park everywhere, but we got there's a National Wildlife Refuge somewhere in your state. We had the first refuge set aside for waterfowl specifically. That was the Lower Klamath. That was done in 1908. And all of this precedes these formalized institutions like the National Park Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, although their precursors are in there, right? Like the stuff that they will evolve into, or the nuggets, the seeds for those are planted. And all of this is building, right? And so you kind of come into the teens and 20s, and you again, it's building off of this growing recognition. It's like, okay, we're seeing this decline in stuff, we're seeing this depletion. Okay, now all of a sudden it's recognizing, well, especially with stuff like water birds and migratory birds, like it doesn't matter what we do down in Mississippi, like if they're being completely shot out in Canada or South Dakota or Wisconsin and Minnesota, that's going to have an impact. So you see this recognition come in, and the first wildlife refuge specifically set aside with the intention of migratory birds comes in shortly after the Migratory Bird Act Treaty. So the Migratory Bird Act Treaty was 1918. Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife Refuge was established, kind of building off of that, and that's spans multiple states in the Upper Mississippi, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa. And that happened in 1924. So it's this continuous evolution of okay, we've seen the degradation, we've seen the demise of these important things, like stuff that you can't ignore, like the disappearance of the passenger pigeon was just phenomenal considering where they came from and how quickly it happened.
Absolutely.
The extinction of the Carolina parakeet, like these are like, and this happened in like 1916, 1914, 1918.
Yeah.
Right? Like in the 20th century, these
Yeah.
animals are going extinct. And so people are like, whoa, I mean, that's a thing. And so you're seeing these things, and as they evolve and they move forward. And then the 1930s hit, and you have the Dust Bowl era.
Mm-hmm.
So not only are species disappearing, but you're seeing just this incredible loss of productivity in farmland and agriculture across the center part of the United States. And you're seeing people go, whoa, like we really got to do something, right? Like stuff's going sideways. We literally can't live here, and we have to move. And all of that is feeding these mechanisms that come about. So in 1930, you have the American Game Policy drafted. Aldo Leopold was a big part of that commission, and they basically identified and said, hey, we need a funding mechanism to support these activities. We need a funding mechanism to protect wildlife and wild places. And that led to, in 1934, you had the duck stamp that came out at a federal level. So all of a sudden you have a requirement for hunters, independent of state laws and independent of state regulations and hunting licenses. Now you have to buy a federal duck stamp, because ducks are great with directions, but they're terrible about state boundaries. And you got to get this duck stamp, and that money is going to go directly to setting aside land and resources for waterfowl. And it's not just the ducks that are benefiting from it, right? Like you've got your curlews, you've got your peeps, you've got your oyster catchers, you've got your turnstones, you've got whatever it is, like the birds that depend on this stuff are benefiting from it, and they may not necessarily be game species. So that comes in 34. In 1935, the Soil Conservation Service was established. That becomes Natural Resources Conservation Service in the 90s. And then 1937 hits, and you have this Wildlife Restoration Act passed, which is Pittman-Robertson. And it really sort of changes the game with how this stuff is funded. And it really is. And if you're only going to listen to one thing on this podcast that I say, the Pittman-Robertson and later the Dingell-Johnson Acts, they really are some of the most amazing pieces of legislation for conservation management and resource management in the history of humanity. They are the most efficient and effective way to fund management and conservation of resources that I have ever seen. And, I alluded to this in our introduction. I worked in places that didn't have these funding mechanisms, and it's a battle. You're constantly fighting for every nickel and every dime, and it's hard. It's hard work. And what these acts do is they create this incredible chain of execution that brings in hunters and anglers, that brings in manufacturers and industry, that brings in the federal government, that brings in the state government to create a success cycle that is just unparalleled. And it's a phenomenal creation in North America that has really brought us back from the brink for a lot of populations, right? Like we now have deer and turkey in numbers in the eastern United States that haven't been there for 150 years. And a lot of that ties back to it's because it's being funded, it's because it's a priority, and it's because it's building off of the best science with the best people, and they've got money going towards them to pay for that. So yeah, once we hit Pittman-Robertson in 37, things really start to expand. We see other funding models come in. We see other grant programs come in. Dingell-Johnson comes in 1950. There was that little hiccup, World War II, that sort of slowed things down on the conservation funding side of stuff. But 1950 is when the Sport Fish Restoration Act, Dingell-Johnson, is signed, and it takes that model of what Pittman-Robertson, the Wildlife Restoration Act, does, and it applies it to sport fish and those activities. And we can unpack what that actually looks like. But the important part is that it's taking money that everyday hunters and anglers are spending on gear and equipment, and it's getting that through the manufacturers of that equipment, and it's sending it to the states through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
So, at its root, Pittman-Robertson really is an excise tax on firearms and ammunition. Later expanded to archery. Not sure exactly when that was, but I know that came out later time. So that every firearm, every bullet, right, purchased in the U.S., there is a portion of that goes to support conservation through those excise taxes, and really it was a brilliant plan, because ultimately, manufacturers, as I understand it, were not incredibly opposed to it, right? Because it was the idea that healthier wildlife equated to more hunters for them equated to more customers, right? So it was sort of a proposition. So let's raise the entire boat, from a conservation perspective through the use of excise funds to help the wildlife, to help manufacturers, to help the U.S. establish this really solid platform of conservation in the U.S. So, yeah, I mean, I cannot speak with authority on the way in which every country in the world funds or manages wildlife, but I think it's fairly safe to say that the system that has been developed in the U.S. Really does stand among the top for being able to provide funds for conservation, to perform that work, to appropriately divvy out the funds for projects that are of significant priority or significant need. And so it's awesome. It's really cool. I think it's important to relate it back to the historical aspect, because it's without knowing where you came from, it's difficult to really identify or understand the significance of where we are today as it relates to supporting these efforts within the United States. So thanks for jumping into the history of it there with me. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I hope I did it justice. I'm sure there's some environmental historians out there that are spitting nails at my summary, but yeah, I think I'd quibble just a little bit with with what you said about Pittman Robertson. The excise tax existed prior to Pittman Robertson. It just went into the general fund.
Oh,
So
I did
what
not know
Pittman
that.
so what Pittman Robertson did was they said, okay, we've got this excise tax. People are already paying these taxes. We're going to take that tax and we're going to make it so that it has to go towards wildlife conservation. And it's going to do that through this program to send money to states so that they can manage their wildlife the best way they see fit. Now, the real kicker with Pittman Robertson, the real thing that is sort of the sneaky, uh, crazy good foresight thing. Like when you read history a lot, you think about, why did they say it that way? And holy moly, that still works today, even though it's X number of years later. The real
Hmm.
kicker with Pittman Robertson is it has a piece of writing in there, and it's right up at the top, and it says it's the assent legislation, the assent clause. And it basically says, hey, states, if you want any of this sweet, sweet PR money, these federal dollars, not only do you have to guarantee that the federal dollars are going to go towards your wildlife management and conservation, you have to guarantee that your license sales dollars also go towards that. So you can't, even though that's state generated, right? Like it's a separate funding
Hmm.
stream, even though that's separate from what we're doing at the federal level, it still has to go towards the management and conservation of wildlife, or you don't get this federal source of funding that's generated through this funding mechanism. So there are a couple of things with the legislation that really were sort of just these, you look back at it and you're like, man, yeah, that's good call.
Good call.
Good call. Way to go, folks. Way to make that happen.
So I'm curious on how it works more in the today terms. So, uh, obviously we live in the United States. There's always a lot of firearm sales and ammunition sales. So this money goes into, I'm quite certain that I'm oversimplifying this. I'm almost positive that I am. So, those excise taxes come into, a metaphorical large bucket of money. And then that money gets distributed to state agencies, gets distributed to other projects that may be occurring through NGOs that are focused on conservation, etc. How does that system work as it relates to determining how this piece of this pie is divvied up to support conservation?
That's a great question, and it could be a multi-part. Like we should get Ken Burns on this because he could do like a 6-part miniseries on this, and really cover all the bases. But to try to be succinct,
I'll give him a
yeah,
call, see if he's
yeah,
available.
yeah. Could you just call him, Jay?
Let's
Could you
ring
just
him up.
call Ken Burns? Yeah, ring him up. He
Oh,
did that
Kenny.
national, yeah, he did that national parks thing. Well, let's get him in on this. So the way it works, and I'll try to be succinct. You and I buy hunting and fishing equipment. We
Yep.
pay an excise tax, and it differs because these, Pittman Robertson Pittman Robertson has been around for almost 90 years. Dingle Johnson just celebrated 75th year. There's been a lot of tweaks to this and improvements and additions along the way. So we've got multiple pots that these acts have created, pots of funding. So and each of those pots has a different criteria and different benefits and blah blah blah. But the main gist is you and I pay excise tax on our hunting and fishing equipment. The people responsible for actually writing the checks to the federal government, to the Department of Treasury, are the manufacturers. So
Mm-hmm.
your federal ammunition, I'm here in Minnesota. Federal's a big thing. Federal ammunition here in Minnesota. St. Croix rods in Wisconsin. You know, Berkeley Fishing, which is headquartered out of Iowa. So they're the ones that are writing the checks, and they do that on a quarterly basis. And it's an incredible relationship because at the end of the day, for a lot of these manufacturers, this is the single biggest check they write as an expense, right? And so like this is a big deal. It's a big deal for them. It's a big deal in terms of the funding that we receive. That money goes to the Treasury.
Mm.
The Treasury packages that all up and then sends it to us, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, on a quarterly basis. So we get these sort of estimates throughout the year. At the end of the fiscal cycle, the federal fiscal calendar, which is October 1 to September 30th, because that makes complete logical sense for everybody involved. I honestly, I don't know why the federal fiscal is that way. It just is. It's one of those things. So at the end of that cycle, we get these quarterly estimates that, Treasury saying, okay, this is what we're estimating we're receiving. This is what we're estimating you're getting. We get the final numbers. So the money that comes into our pipeline is a year old at that point, right? So like all the stuff that comes out. We then have formulas that calculate how much each state or territory gets. Now there's 50 states and 6 territories. DC does not get any Pittman-Robertson funding for Washington, DC, but they do get Sportfish funding. There's an asterisk with that because they are eligible to receive some of these, you mentioned these side projects that get funded. So, but the main programs for wildlife restoration, sportfish restoration, I'm going to stick to those for just a moment. And those are, the calculations for that, for wildlife restoration and sportfish, they include the amount of area a state has in relation to the rest of the United States. It includes the population of a state in relation to the United States, and it includes the number of people buying hunting or fishing licenses. And there's tweaks and slight nuances to those formula appropriations. But at the end of the day, it comes down to state geography, state population, and how many people are buying hunting or fishing licenses. So the more people that are buying licenses, the more you improve that apportionment. So states are motivated, and this gets back to some of our earlier conversations, states are motivated to have hunters and anglers, not only because it generates that direct revenue of them buying a license that goes straight to the state pot, but the more hunters and anglers they have, the more they can tilt that equation so that they receive more of this federal funding. So when you're buying a hunting license, you're doing a couple of things. You've got the direct injection of revenue into the state, but you also have that indirect of contribution to whatever the state is getting from their federal share. So that's kind of the real broad strokes, big picture of how this stuff is determined, how states get determined on what they're getting. Now, Fish and Wildlife is broken up we break up the country into regions. I'm here in the Midwest region. The Midwest tends to do pretty well with their apportionments because we have states like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, where hunting is still a very big cultural component of the population. We also have some states that are sort of on the tail end of that stuff, because the other thing with Pittman-Robertson, they made some really good side rails that no state would receive more than X% of the total apportionment available, and no state would receive less than. So we have some states that are minimum states, like they just get the bare minimum because they either don't have the population, or they don't have the territory, or they don't have the license sales to go beyond that. But at the bare minimum, they were receiving the some funding from this formula. So that's kind of the quick and dirty explanation of how that works. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I like it. So we talk about frequently that PR funds go to support conservation, and conservation is a very, very much an umbrella statement, right? So I'm curious about what real life, right, like tangible things does this money go to support for a state agency or, those side project NGO projects? What sort of things can this money go toward?
So they're eligible expenses that can go to this. Now, all of this is with the caveat that these are reimbursement
Mm-hmm.
monies, right? The state has to pony up the money. For most of the programs with Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson, it's guaranteed money to the states, but the state still has to show that they are going to use it in an appropriate manner, right? So that's where my job comes in, is to sit there and say the state has to submit an application and say this is what we want to use this money for, even though it's it's intended to go straight, it's intended to go to the states, but there's this check and balance that's in the equation, and that's what we're doing, and we're working with the states to make sure that these are eligible expenses, that they are necessary and reasonable, and that they are a good use of public money. So that's part of the thing where it's like, you can have a state that wants to, it's just like anything, Jay, right? Like I want a real fancy truck, but I can't afford a real fancy truck. I drive a 20-year-old Toyota. It gets me where I need to go. Like that's what I can do. So we work with the states to make sure that what they're asking for is really what's needed and can get the job done.
Mm-hmm.
And so the eligible expenses that we have, like I said earlier, we kind of divide the stuff into different pots. And so you have your wildlife restoration activities, and that can be anything from acquiring land for wildlife habitat. It can be doing disease management. It can be surveying wildlife populations. It can be like the nuts and bolts sort of wildlife management science and work that states have to do every day of every year to make sure that wildlife populations are healthy and thriving, and they have a handle on it. You also have these pots that go towards hunter education. There's dedicated pots that feed hunter education. So your firearm safety, your hunter ed, your sort of the thing you have to do in most states in order to buy a license, a hunting license, just to show that you have a fundamental understanding and knowledge of safe firearms handling and hunting principles. You also have funding that goes towards the construction and management and development of shooting ranges across the United States. Those are increasingly important. You just mentioned a second ago that we've got a lot of firearms in the country. People need a safe place to practice with those firearms. And the real kicker with that is, for a lot of years, hunters and anglers really drove sort of that Pittman Robertson, Dingle Johnson pot of money.
Mm-hmm.
But for the last 20-ish years, the majority of that funding has come from the sales of firearms and ammunition. And so you have those recreational shooters that are really powering the growth of this fund over the last 15, 20 years. So having a safe place for them to shoot is not only a good idea from a user standpoint, but it's also a good idea from a customer service standpoint to say, hey, we got people that are buying this stuff. We need to make sure that they've got resources for them as well. And so that's another dedicated pot. On the fishing side, and I'm not a sport fish biologist, so I'm not a fisheries biologist. So again, when the knives come out and people want to educate me, I'm happy to learn more. But on the fishing side, it's stuff like the nuts and bolts fisheries management, so fish hatcheries, stocking fish, doing creel surveys, making sure fish diseases aren't spreading across the landscape, kind of that core wildlife management sort of suite of stuff. But then you also have aquatic education programs that are funded through the Dingle Johnson Act. You have additional programming like setting up infrastructure for boaters to have safe places to dispose of waste and pump out stations. You have infrastructure programs that build places for people to put temporary, moorings and slips and docks for boats to come into and utilize. Because similar to sort of how Guns and Ammos have really powered Pittman Robertson for the last 20 years, a huge source of funding for the Dingle Johnson side of the equation is in 1984 there was an amendment that added a tax to boat fuel, and that just skyrocketed the revenue on the Dingle Johnson side. So again, from a customer service standpoint, it's like, okay, we're taxing people that are using boat fuel. We need to give them facilities so that they can continue to use boat fuel. In addition to, we need to be doing stuff to support fish hatcheries and research. And so that's the very ambiguous broad stroke stuff, like specific concrete examples of what these things do. There is a project in Michigan to reintroduce Arctic grayling in Michigan for the first time in a long time. I don't even know how many years. That is being funded through sport fish restoration funding. There is, the reintroduction of turkeys to the upper Midwest. Before the mid 1970s, Wisconsin and Minnesota didn't have turkeys because they had been hunted out. And now we've got turkeys in every county in Minnesota all the way up to the Canadian border because of what wildlife restoration has done. We've seen the growth of hunter ed programs across the country, and the benefit of the growth of hunter ed programs is we've seen a dramatic decline in the number of hunting accidents that happen every year. So these are all sort of like the real deal, like when the rubber meets the road, what is happening with this stuff? It's the growth and management of these populations. It's agencies that are able to adapt to an increasingly challenging and changing natural environment and foster the safe participation in these activities.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about the connections that are kind of being made here a little bit, in that we recently had Tanaya Bethke from the Council of Advanced Hunting and Shooting Sports on the Evolving Hunter podcast, and we talked about the importance and some strategies being taken of really bringing hunters in and or back, right? Whether that be new hunters or reactivating hunters who may have stopped hunting and keeping the ones that we have. And then we're leading into this conversation where we're really talking about that much of the funds that we have in support of conservation in the U.S. is driven by participation. It's driven by folks buying hunting licenses right from the state level, and also buying ammo and guns and archery equipment so as to be able to participate in those activities. And it's all really quite dependent on all of that.
Absolutely. And just to put some numbers on that, like we were talking about, they're supporting conservation, they're paying monies. It's, even if you're in this world, even if you buy a license, right? Like my state Minnesota deer license is like $25, right? Like that doesn't sound like much in today's money, but when you think about, so for Pittman Robertson, since 1939, these programs have generated over $30 billion
with a B
to go towards management and conservation across 56 states and territories. So like that doesn't happen anywhere else.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, the participation, it's important because of what it produces and the benefits that it gives. And it's not just benefits to hunters, and it's not just benefits to anglers, right? Like there are a ton of species that utilize these systems that hunters and anglers don't harvest. There are a ton of people that are out on these wildlife management areas that don't want to hunt, but they're out there birding, they're out there exercising their dogs, they're out there jogging around, they're doing whatever, they're doing it to be outside. And so these benefits go far beyond just hunters and anglers. This isn't an exclusive club. This is a benefit for all. And so, yeah, that participation, it is important. And it's one of the reasons why we keep having these conversations about why is getting more people involved, or why is getting more people re-involved, an important conversation to have.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. My next question, I promise you, it's not a gotcha question. I'm just genuinely curious. And I know that you work for the federal government, so if you decline to answer, I'll cut it out. Um, but I, I have a hard time, and you probably already know where I'm going, but I have a hard time with the thought of hunters and anglers carry a lot of load for conservation in the U.S., right? Particularly compared to other users of these natural spaces, hikers and bird watchers, and et cetera, right? Do you, do you have, I obviously have, I was very leading in that, right? I obviously have opinions on that, right? In that, there's a lot of weight on the participation of hunters and anglers to keep this really awesome system moving and grooving. But there's honestly more recreationalists out there enjoying the fruit of those funds that are not necessarily paying into a system. Is that something that you have opinions on? If not, I can just keep on talking.
I appreciate that. I think it's a really interesting question to explore, and it's one
Hmm.
that's been talked about for decades, right?
Yeah.
You have, to your point, you have a small population. At this point, I think the percentage of Americans that hunt is under 5% of all Americans, and we're paying into
Hmm.
the system. And there's more people that shoot recreationally, and they're kind of the ones that are really carrying the heavy load in the last 20 years, or those
Sure.
recreational shooters. And what's interesting about that is that most of them, and there are studies that have been done on this, most of them don't even know they're paying into the system because they just shoot and they never hunt.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing to me is that when you ask them follow-ups and you say, oh, well, hey, there's this whole funding model that exists that you're paying into that you didn't know about. Do you support it? The vast majority of them go, oh yeah, that's a great, yeah, we support that. So
Yeah.
you have this population that didn't know they were being taxed, get told they're being taxed, and go, oh yeah, that's a good application. Yeah, I'm fine with that. What what other when does that happen? It rarely happens. So you have this thing that people value, wild places, wildlife, and we come to that in different ways. And this notion about other sort of tax models being put into place, that's been talked about since the early 90s. Back in 92, 94, they were talking about the backpack tax
Yeah.
and what that could look like, and how we could get stuff like binoculars and backpacks and hiking boots and water bottles and
Hmm.
all of that stuff paying into some sort of a pot. And it doesn't seem to have the same support that the Pittman Robertson and Dingo Johnson stuff had. You've got other funding mechanisms that are being looked at in terms of diverting revenue from drilling operations around the country into a funding pot that would be a little bit more broadly general. So there was a lot of the Restoring America's Wildlife Act, RAWA, came really close to getting passed, and then they couldn't quite figure out how the funding model was going to work, and it didn't make it across the line. But so I'm just using that as an example of these other
Yeah.
conversations of like, how do we get additional funding into these areas? But to your point, my opinion on the matter is that I don't think that those conversations around the backpack tax have the urgency or the weight behind them that PR and DJ did, because I don't think they have that same context around their formation, right? Like
Hmm.
PR is 1937. The Dust Bowl just happened. People remember things going extinct. Like that immediacy of we got to do something
Yeah.
just isn't quite there in the 90s or even into today. So I think it's one of those things that that Ben Franklin quote, you'll know the value of water when the well runs dry. Like
Yeah. No,
that
absolutely.
so that's my opinion on it, is that one of the reasons that I don't think it's gone very far, or hasn't gone as far as it could have gone, like in terms of drawing parallels between PR and DJ, is that there's just not that immediacy of holy buckets, we got to do something, we got to move, because if we don't, we ain't gonna have a place to go bird watching or trail jogging or goat yoga or whatever it is, right? Like it doesn't matter. However you choose to commune in the outdoors, that's fine. But, we there's that lack of immediate urgency to say we need something more here. And so that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. In those days, the need was illuminated, right? About why this needed to occur. And we're not necessarily in that position now. But it's also kind of one of those situations where like I stopped taking my medicine because I started feeling better. You know,
There's that
Probably
there's
because you're
there's that
taking your
element.
medicine, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can
Yep.
never have this conversation without. I'm a huge Parks and Rec fan, right? I can never have this conversation without thinking about a scene in Parks and Rec where Ron Swanson was trying to find a way to monetize nature, and he was like positioning like, enter a nickel, look at a bird, pay a dime, look at a deer.
Yeah. 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 It is interesting because, you see these other funding models that are trying to step into to that gap, right? Like I know there's that 1% for the planet that a lot of, that's out there, and you've got these other foundations and donation mechanisms that are out there, but they don't come near to what is being funded through what's happening with Pittman Robertson and Dingle Johnson, and they don't have the same efficacy in terms of, okay, is this money doing what we need it to do, right? Like it, that I've explored the 1% for the planet stuff a little bit, and it's a bit of a black box, and it just, it kind of goes in and it's like, hey, we're doing great work, we did this dam removal over here, but we're doing great work and trust us, and it's like, okay, I guess, but with Pittman Robertson and the Dingle Johnson stuff, we and it's silly, there's the human being grown adult in me that's like, I'm going to spend how much time to make sure that we've got every penny accounted for in this grant? Like 1 cent is really going to be worth the communication and back and forth and tracking down and bird dogging down like where that 1 cent might have gone. And from a practical standpoint, that feels a little silly, but from, a transparency model to be like, hey, no, we've got to be accountable. We need to make sure that everything that we know where that stuff is.
Yeah,
And, I've seen states write checks for less than $1 to pay back the federal government for stuff that they messed up. And it's just like, this may not be worth the paper it's printed on, but
yeah.
at least it is, the principle behind it is like this, there's a lot of integrity to it. And so I don't see that level of integrity, oversight, adjustment. And I don't mean oversight in a cumbersome way, but I mean it in like, our job for all of us in this partnership is to protect this program because it is so effective and it is so important.
Absolutely. I think it's really important for listeners to understand that even if you're not a hunter right now, if you're just listening to this podcast because you're curious about hunting, if you're someone that enjoys going into natural spaces, you are someone who is benefiting from this funding system that we have in the U.S. 100%, and I don't know, like I try to relate back to, and I'm not saying there are people that are outspoken. I have no idea what I'm talking about at this point. So, just take that with a grain of salt. I don't know if there's like opponents to, out there saying, hey, we as the other side of the outdoor industry, we do not want to provide support. I would imagine that is almost the opposite, because I believe that intrinsically as humans, we like to have natural spaces and wild places, in the world. I don't know anyone that I've ever met that would look out over a beautiful, beautiful mountain view and say, make that look better. Maybe a coal plant right there on top of that mountain. That'd be great. Let's do that. Let's cut all these trees down. Get rid of that river. People, we like that. Like we're ingrained to like those things. But at the end of the day, I think it takes money and effort and time and concerted, legislation and all of those things to make sure that it stays that way, because it's easy to have short memory right? But it wasn't that long ago we did not have a lot of those things because of the lack of the aforementioned items.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, Jay, to your point, like this is stuff, this is a little bit of a tangent, a little bit of a side note, but
let's go on.
that's not ancient history.
No.
Okay. This is stuff that, you know, we as a population prioritize development and growth above those resources. And we became a very elite club that set water on fire. Okay.
I'm
Like
laughing.
that's,
It's not funny. It's a laugh. It's a laugh sad.
it's a very, it's a head scratching accomplishment. Now,
Sure.
because of a lot of the stuff that we put in place, and this is independent of PR and DJ, and I'm not trying to sell this program more than it is, but because of the priorities we put on clean water and clean spaces, I think it was last year they had sturgeon spawning in the Cuyahoga River for the first time
Wow.
in a long time. And so we can, with time and with money, we can turn a lot of stuff around. We can go from having water catch on fire to fish older than the dinosaurs spawning in that same river system. But it takes money and it takes effort and it takes support. And even if to that listener that's listening to this podcast that doesn't hunt and doesn't really want to hunt, and why would you ever do that? It's because these activities support so much more than just hunting. And
Mm-hmm.
if we lose that broader social support, you don't have to want to hunt, but just see and value why other people do and try to understand what they get out of it. If we lose that broader social support and political support, we're going to lose those places
Mm-hmm.
because they will be taken away, because some other people with bigger political and social support will come in and say, hey, you know what, this WMA, it'd be better as a subdivision, or this, river bottom, it'd be better as a water park. And so, yeah, if you like these places, if you like the wildlife around you, there's a lot to be said for supporting these activities, even if you don't want to participate in them directly. I mean, there was back in my learn to hunt days, we had multiple people that came out and they were like, you know what, I don't think I could shoot an animal. And it's like, you don't have to, but we're going to go out and I'm going to show you exactly what all this is about so that you can see why I do it. And, if an animal comes out, you don't have to pull the trigger. We're not going to put a bullet in the gun, but I want you to like go through those motions and, put the crosshairs on it and see that you could do it if you wanted to,
Mm-hmm.
because those opinions may change. We evolve all the time. We're constantly evolving and taking in new information, synthesizing it with the information that we already have, coming out to the other end with maybe a different conclusion or a slightly different perspective. That's part of living. And so if you're absolutely against this stuff and you can't ever imagine wanting to do it, I think you owe it to yourself to explore it and see what it's like, because at the very least, you'll get to spend some time sitting outside.
For sure. For sure. That, I feel like that's a really great bow on a lot of this conversation. But before I jump to something else, I always have this paranoia, right? When I talk to folks who have just immense amounts of knowledge in a certain topic, that I may have missed something, right? That may have been really critical, part of the conversation or a point that should have been made. So, before we jump away from talking about conservation funding in the U.S., is there anything that I didn't ask or that we didn't touch on that you feel is a really integral part to bring up to listeners so they can better understand the bigger topic?
Oh, this is a big conversation. This is, how wildlife is funded in the United States and North America. It's a huge conversation. We've got mechanisms in place that are 90 and 75 years old. Got a lot of stuff coming out of it. There are a ton of resources that are out there. A lot of the stuff is publicly available. You don't have to do crazy digging and asking people on nameless forums or anything. I think if you're interested in this stuff and you really want to see what this stuff is, all of this is publicly available information. We have a really great website with our Partner with a Pair initiative. This whole initiative came out because it was built around trying to explain how this stuff works.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can tap into, you can see exactly how much each state is getting for their annual apportionment. You can go back in time and look at what they've gotten over the years. You can see what they're reporting for their certified number of licenses in the state. You can see where some of this money is going to. The fact that we've got over 800 shooting ranges across the United States that are funded through these efforts. And these are not, some of them are just sort of unstaffed ranges that are out in nowhere and just a bench and a berm and a be safe sign. And some of them are really high dollar. They're essentially community centers that have a shooting range attached to them. And they're really there to not just give people a place to shoot, but to teach people how to shoot. They teach people how to butcher animals. They teach people how to operate in this world. So, if you're interested in this stuff and you want to learn more about it, I strongly encourage you to take a look at the Partner with a Pair website. We've got a lot of great resources out there. And, the funny thing about this day and age, Jay, is that it's no longer this information limited time, right? Like we all have a cell phone in our pocket that can
Mm-hmm.
essentially tap into the cumulative human experience and just by looking at it, right? We open up our phone. But increasingly we're in this really weird, good information limited time. And so it's hard to find the good stuff because that's not always what pops up to the first three results on whatever search you're using. So when you're in doubt, going to those state agencies, going to the federal agencies that are doing these things, I think that's where you're going to find that's going to be a great place to start before you start going down these rabbit holes of YouTube or Facebook or Reddit or wherever you're getting your information, because those are the folks. I mean, we're the ones that are doing it. We're the ones that are that are that are managing the wildlife. We're the ones that are managing these programs. We're the ones that are managing getting new hunters and anglers out there. So that would kind of just be, the thing that I would just make sure everybody knows is if you want more information, go to your public agency. They work for you, and so they owe you an explanation if you have questions.
Excellent. Well, James, I am immensely grateful. I'm grateful for the work that you do with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'm grateful for you taking the time to sit down and have a conversation with me today. I really, really am. I'm thankful for it.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm happy to talk about this stuff anytime. If you really want to unpack this stuff and nerd out about where money's going and what it's doing and how it's doing it, I'm happy to come back anytime or just talk turkey hunting and new hunter experiences. I'm happy to talk about that too. So, there aren't a lot of voices out there for new hunters, and I think it's important that they have that. And there are a lot of folks that know how to do this stuff backwards and forwards and go into the Rocky Mountains for days on end with horse trains and a 7-person support staff, but that ain't me. And
Yeah.
it's not a lot of hunters. And so being a resource for folks that don't know what they want to do or how they want to do it, but they're curious and they know they feel that drive, I think it's an important voice. So I appreciate you doing it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who maybe is thinking about getting into hunting, or maybe someone that you would like to start hunting with. And I'd also love to hear from you. If you have any questions or comments for the show, please send them in at community@evolvinghunter.com. That's COMMUNITY @evolvinghunter.com. Any questions that you send in, we'll answer them live on the show, and our guests will get a chance to weigh in on their thoughts as well, just like we did at the beginning of this episode. If you want to follow along, please make sure that you're subscribed to the Evolving Hunter podcast. We're on Instagram and YouTube at Evolving Hunter Podcast, all one word. And we've got more conversations and hunting stories coming, along with practical conversations about skills, ethics, and what it takes to grow as a hunter. So please follow along with us. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep evolving. I really hope you enjoyed that episode of the Evolving Hunter podcast. One last thing before you go. If you're thinking about getting into hunting, before you go and buy gear or plan a hunt, you need the right foundation. That's why we're so excited to be partnered with CertifiedHunter.com. They have state-approved online hunter education that teaches real-world safety, ethics, and responsibility, not just test answers. If you want to start hunting the right way, head to CertifiedHunter.com/evolvinghunter and get certified today.